Absolute pleasure that I take her role of introducing for one talk to me this afternoon, and I only have 2 points to make that I'll be very brief. You know who she is. You think you know who she is, but you were here because of her. Without Sandra, there would be no Summer Institute. Just a simple matter of fact. The second, on the paper, which she's going to talk about today, is if you ask how long what we're doing will last, what's the half-life of our work? Well, I don't know. Someone is going to take an hour or 2. But what she's doing is going to last for 100 years at least. What's that? Well, it's her introduction of the greatest piece of scholarship by one of the greatest of all scholarly 20th century liberals about the greatest of all 19th century liberals. And the scholarship in Hayek's book will tell you about is just unbelievably dense. And then it will, but she'll tell you about it, so go ahead.
Thanks, David. I don't generally present at the Summer Institute anymore because I'll let David, who's now the coherent one, so if this is a little scattered, that's just put it down to me being out of practice, not having done anything too much. This what I'm going to talk to you about is something that I guess I would call a labor of love. I've been working on it for a long, long time. I finally sent it off to Bruce Caldwell, who's the general editor, who then signed off, and so it's now in Chicago. So I posted online, and I'm sorry it's so hot in here. We're working to get the temperature cooled, reduced, and just by way of excuse for my odd appearance, we have no power in our house, and so it's been one of those evenings and mornings and so on. So at any rate, all that aside, I'm going to tell you the story, or at least try to give you the story of Hayek on Mill. I did post the full introduction online, but for this audience, I thought it would be good to give you a little bit more of the big picture. So I'm not going to, that's a 50-page introduction with footnotes that would do Sam Hollander proud, and I won't take you through all of that detail. But I wanted to just kind of give you a sense of what I was working on with the book. Where did the book go? I brought it down here, a copy of Hayek on Mill. Did someone take my book? At any rate, I'll show it to you if I can find it. I started with a tiny book, well, medium-sized book, Hayek on Mill, the Mill-Taylor Correspondence, and then have added to that other works that Hayek did. So let me just see if I can get my pointer to work. Here's the contents of the Hayek on Mill. That's basically the book that he published, and I'll tell you some things about how he collected the stuff to put in this and so on. And then to that, I've added other things that Hayek wrote on Mill that haven't been collected together. And so I thought I would just show you some of the other works that this is not, individualism, true and false, which we know, Hayek has a lot to say about Mill. But these are his introduction, for instance, to Considerations on Representative Government, his preface to the Mill biography by Pack. There are a couple of things about him looking for portraits of John Stuart Mill and so on. So a number of pieces and then some correspondence. And the name Viner came up yesterday, and there's some Viner correspondence because he was actually a rock star. so he's an important person in this story. So the story. David sort of gave away a little bit of the big story, but it's, and I'll give you some evidence of this. People sometimes say that economists aren't all that interesting. And Sue will appreciate this. It's largely about a love story between John Stuart Mill and Harriet Taylor, who then eventually becomes Harriet Mill. There's two incredible sets of characters. So there's a lot of complexity here. There's the 19th century characters and the 20th century characters, and I'll give you a little bit about each of them. So in the 19th century, we've got, as David said, you know, the most important liberal of the 19th century who's involved in the anti-slavery debate, who's a logician, who talks about women's rights to own property, literary critic, a philosopher, and so on. So that's Mill. We then have Harriet Taylor, his friend and colleague, a writer in her own right, of importance in her own right. And part of what we'll talk about in some detail is, you know, just how much her influence and what it consisted of was on John Stuart Mill. And then, of course, we've got all the people who are part of Mill's circle, including, most importantly, for some of the work that David and I have done and pushing product now. That the Vanity of the Philosopher, which has a lot of that work, is over there if you'd like it. Thomas Carlyle, who's important, you know, sort of a central figure on the pro-slavery side of things, and his wife Jane Welsh. And then we've got all the French who are called utopian socialists by some as a pejorative name, but in particular Gustave Deichtel. So that's John Taylor, pretty good-looking guy. Harriet Taylor, who at this point is married to John Taylor. I didn't, the book's in here, under here. Okay, so this is the book that we start with, and then we're adding to that material. John Stuart, there aren't a lot of great portraits of John Stuart, but he's on this year's t-shirt. So by the time Harriet actually gets to be able to marry John Stuart, they're in fairly ill health, and John looks a little bit more like this than John Taylor, the other spouse. I should read the back of the t-shirt for you now, I think. It says, just finding up here, the tracing of unpublished manuscripts is the kind of detective work which most people will enjoy doing as a recreation in their spare time. Anyone want to take a guess as to who wrote that? That would be Hayek. And of course, you know, so today's story was really about Hayek doing that. And I don't think he did it all in his spare time. So, moving along here. In the 20th century, the characters then, we have Keynes, Lord Keynes, who's the other person we'll be talking about in some detail today. Cambridge economist, very flamboyant and so on. I've got a picture of him coming up there. Lionel Robbins, many of you will know of Robbins, of course, the Nature and Significance Robbins, head of the LSE early in the 20th century. Jacob Viner, I have to say, you know, Canadian, early on connected to the Chicago School, and then we've got Hayek, of course, who's the main person who's involved in my story, and so there's a couple of those characters. So the question then is, you know, how does this 20th century group get mixed up with the 19th century group? Hayek's interest in John Stuart Mill starts very early on in his career, and it spans pretty much of his career. He writes that he unintentionally becomes the foremost expert on John Stuart Mill, and you know, however unintentional it was, he is, by World War II, the person who knows more about John Stuart Mill than anyone in the world. So he sets about to collect these letters, and much of what I'm putting together in the related papers really is a story about just how big that task was, because those of you who know the John Stuart Mill works know that there are 33 volumes of the Mill works, and they had been pretty much dispersed, and the volumes that are the letters, so there's the earlier letters and the later letters, they didn't exist in any one spot. And in particular, Hayek writes that the greater part of Mill's books and papers appear at the time of his death to have been at his cottage in Avignon, where he lived with Harriet, who became his wife, Harriet Mill. In February 1905, people related to Mill went to Avignon to liquidate the household. They did there the work, as they put it, of 3 months and 3 weeks, half a ton of letters to be sorted, all manner of rubbish to be separated from useful things, books to be dusted, selected from arrangements to be made, 18 boxes to be packed. and they packed up, what they thought should be kept, and then the rest, and then they were sold at market, so they were dispersed. And so Hayek then has the task of finding, to whom they were sold and getting hold of them. In 48, he writes to Austin Robinson, who was secretary of the RES at the time, about the possibility of two sorts of publications. So at first he thinks he's going to collect the Taylor Mill letters. And then he realizes, by then he's collected so much that he realizes that, in fact, it should be split into a couple of different kinds of publications. One, which would become the volume, this volume, the Friendship, I'm calling it the Friendship, edited by him, and then a second, more voluminous volume, in fact, it stretches into several volumes, which would be edited by someone else. So he says, I've come across a great deal of correspondence between Mill and the famous Mrs. Taylor, who was ultimately to become Mrs. Mill. For a number of reasons, these letters are not suitable for inclusion in a straightforward edition of his letters. Both sides of the correspondence must be given. A good deal of it is unsuitable for publication because it deals with ordinary household matters. Anyone here read Mill's letters? There are these letters about, how many bags of potatoes would you lay in for the winter? That sort of thing. A great deal of explanatory text is required, and the series extends far beyond the year 1848. I've therefore decided to take this part of the correspondence out of the general collection and make a separate book of it, on which I'm now working. So that's his letter where he says, I'm going to write this book, or put this book together. It's almost an edited book, but it's not quite. So it's got a lot of it. So as he says, he includes both sides of the correspondence, and he has a running commentary. And that's what becomes then John Stuart Mill and Harriet Taylor, their friendship, and I'll say a little bit more about that in a minute, and subsequent marriage. So he's telling the story of that relationship. And then the rest of the letters, he says, I'm going to let someone else have those, have access to those, very generously. So the Royal Economic Society at that point then say that they discussed the possibility of Professor Hayek preparing these letters, and they agreed to appoint a committee which will make recommendations about what they're going to do with the rest of the letters. When you read the correspondence, that is Hayek's correspondence or his comments about collecting the letters, first thing, as I said earlier, that you are struck with over the head is just how much work there was to be done. So keep this quotation in mind, right? Because this is clearly someone who actually, didn't, as I say, do this in his spare time. And he actually refers to the pleasure of the hunt, which I think is just a fabulous expression. That's something that he writes in the introduction. He writes the introduction. If you go way back here, he writes the introduction to, where is it? To Minica. I'm not sure I can. Yeah, this one right here. When the letters are actually published, he's the guy. He doesn't edit them, right? Francis Minica, who's at Cornell, edits them, and Hayek, who actually was offered co-editorship because he had done so much work putting the letters together. He says, well, no, I don't really want to be co-editor on it. Minica, you put this stuff together. But in his introduction, he talks about how he had largely the pleasure of the hunt. And I wanted you to know that phrase because I think it's really kind of interesting. And it's interesting because as well, I said there are all these characters involved. Well, there's also correspondence that I've seen between Piero Sraffa and Keynes. Does everyone know who Piero Sraffa is? He's the editor of Ricardo's collected works, Marxist economist. And so to think that Piero Sraffa would be writing Friedrich Hayek in a friendly letter is pretty incredible. And this is actually a letter to Keynes recounting how Keynes has been helped by Hayek. My dear Maynard, this is the most sensational news there has ever been about Ricardo. His letters to James Mill have been found, and a manuscript by Ricardo in addition. Hayek inquired on my behalf. So these are guys who, in the pleasure of the hunt, are getting along and acting like colleagues in ways that it's really hard to imagine economists today, some economists today, sort of working across their intellectual divides. So I thought that was just absolutely fascinating. There's the letter, and it's part of the letter. I've actually, in the part that I pieced together here, I've got 2 different pages, but that's the beginning of it, my dear Maynard. So I thought it was fabulous. You'll see my note on the left, so I used it in the introduction. So the first point I wanted you to just kind of be impressed by is difficulty of pulling this stuff together and just being impressed by Hayek's doggedness in actually finding all of this stuff.
Sandra, can I just a quick question?
Yeah.
Something strikes me in this, which on the surface it seems kind of puzzling that the World Economic Society would be sponsoring this, all these letters on mill and stuff. And I mean, in part you kind of explained it, but again, it's kind of striking.
It is, yeah, it's not, but they were doing projects of this sort. So it's not that this was the only sort of set of letters that they were.
Why would the letters of mill in general, the general correspondence be perfect?
Well, I think Hayek was fairly convincing, that it should be, that it would be important to pull it together. David?
The Royal Society volume of Ricardo has enormous letter correspondence.
Yeah.
So that there's, what is it, 4 volumes of letters?
Yeah.
In the,
I think there's 4.
plus, there's a single volume, which is basically Ricardo's marginal notes on Malthus. That's volume 2 of the set. So Keynes was
they were all collectors. Yeah.
Right, I realize that, but just again, mill is once it's broader than Ricardo, so it's just kind of striking that they brought.
Well, they weren't at the time thinking they were going to pull 33 volumes together. Right. So Hayek was saying, look, I think there's this interesting correspondence, mostly Mill-Taylor, but there's this other stuff, and I'm going to pull the Mill-Taylor stuff out, and that's what I'm going to do as this book. And they don't do the full 33. It's the Toronto press that does that. So they didn't undertake the full, pull the whole millworks together at this point. The second point I wanted to make, sort of broad point by way of not introduction, but related to this, is just how hard it was to get a sense of John Stuart Mill. And even once you read the book and you read Hayek on Mill, you know that there's sort of shifting positions, Hayek positions on Mill. And Hayek remarks that the autobiography itself really isn't very helpful. If you read the autobiography, if you have read it, you'll know that it just doesn't really inform us all that much of certain parts of Mill's life. And in particular, one of the things that Hayek was so interested in was Hayek and Taylor / Mill. And his account of the most valuable friendship of his life is, as Hayek says, not an exception to not really informing us of much in the autobiography. It would be a mistake, he says, to believe that Mill was really like that what he regarded as deserving a public record gives us a picture of the whole man. Mill, there's been some appreciation of this. Mill and Taylor knew that what they wrote was going to be public, although, of course it gets dispersed and it takes a while, 100 years. But, they were people who realized that they needed to be guarded in what they wrote, and I think that's part of the problem with the autobiography in terms of using it as a source on Mill and Taylor. I wanted to remark a little bit, I alluded to this earlier, about the title of the book. In his introduction, I call it To the Friendship, Hayek emphasizes this difficulty of understanding the relationship with Taylor. The two titles of the book, so it was reflect this, at least I think they do. It was first published as John Stuart Mill and Harriet Taylor, their correspondence and subsequent marriage. And then the University of Chicago Press retains that title. But then the errata of the book contains an entry that says, instead of their correspondence, read their friendship. It's not exactly a typo, correspondence says, or whatever. So it may be that Hayek actually reconsidered. I mean, I think he reconsidered what he wanted this book to be known as, and he changed then the title. And here's some additional evidence of this. This is a presentation copy of the book to Margit von Mises, with all best wishes and kindest regards, 61 this is, Hayek. And then you'll see in his writing on the title page, their correspondence is stroked out and friendship has been inserted. So I think he really did reconsider this and think that it should be called, although the friendship as opposed to the correspondence. It is, though, largely correspondence that's been pulled together by Hayek. So he pulls together all this material, and then back to David's point, he publishes the book, and then in '63, the introduction to the earlier letters is published, and he writes the introduction, and then 33 volumes of Mill works really follows on his collection. I mean, not to say that he collects it all, but the fact that he does the work, pulls together the letters, puts out the book in '51, really allows for the Toronto collected works of John Stuart Mill to then be pulled together under the editorship of John Robson. So a huge amount of Mill scholarship becomes possible, largely because of what one person did. The ads in the newspapers, the finding the letters, sort of pulling them together, reading them, making sense of them, and so on. I want to say a word about Hayek's approach in the book, because I think it's a very unusual approach at the time, and one that Hayek hasn't really got any recognition for. But what he does, largely, and he's trying to sort out all these interesting relationships, with Deightel, with Harriet Taylor, and so on, but he allows them to speak largely in their own words. So though he has a running commentary, he also has large amounts of text that he transposes from the letters. And so it really, though it is a book written by Hayek, it's not quite a collection of letters, but it's largely a collection of letters. So it's a very interesting way to write a book in 1951. And largely because he does that, the story of the love story comes through front and center, and I wanted to just emphasize that because sometimes we think economists might be dull and whatever, but I don't, of course. But it's really a story about the enormous cost that these two people paid for their relationship. And Hayek lets that, it's painful to read, so it comes through very clearly. So he clearly perceived and wanted people to understand just what price they paid for this relationship. So a couple of examples. This is a little bit of stuff about Mill and his social group. And Mill was a very social figure. So, though you might think, oh, well, it cost him a friendship with Carlyle, and Carlyle was kind of a cruddy guy, so that's not really a big deal. But all of his other friends as well, were part of that circle, and a couple of them survived, but not many. So just at the beginning of the relationship between Harriet Taylor and John Stuart Mill, they would go to a dinner party, and as Carlyle put it, suppressed titter went round the room, as they arrive at this party, and they come to realize that people are talking about them, and so that then creates an enormous difficulty just in terms of how they sort out how their life will continue. Carlyle seems to have appreciated the toll that it took almost better than anyone else, which is weird because they have this odd relationship themselves. But he talks about how pale Mill looks and how horrible he looks during these early years. Hayek says that the break, and then Carlyle talks to some other people about the relationship in a kind of careless way, and Hayek thinks that that's why their friendship ends. And I think that's probably right. There are some other things that also contribute to that as well. But the real, I don't want to minimize the problem of the friendships and the social stuff because it's very important, but the real awful stuff to read is the letters, or are the letters between Mill and his family, or Harriet and Mill's family, because Mill essentially loses his family over the relationship. So George Grote Mill, who's Mill's brother, falls out with the two of them And Harriet writes to him, I don't answer your letter because you deserve it, that you certainly do not, but because though I'm quite inexperienced in the best way of receiving or replying to an affront, I think that in this, as in all things, frankness and plain speaking are the best rule. Mill writes about a month later, I've long ceased to be surprised at any want of good sense or good manners in what proceeds from you. And then, I didn't put a lot of this letter, but it's a really sad one, from his sister, Mary Coleman, who writes at the end of a long letter that explains why she can no longer be, part of Mill's sort of not friendships, but, continue a relationship with him. And now goodbye. This should close all intercourse between us as I think possible. It will be to me very painful, but at least the sting will be wanting of thinking that I have shrunk from the duty of honesty toward you. And that's the last of the correspondence between Mary, his sister, and John Stuart. So it's in some ways it's a very sad book because that comes pretty early on, the break with the family and so on. And then I guess the other thing I should say is because of the friendships and the soirees ending and so on, they lead this very secluded life. And I'm sure there were social elements to it and so on, but just a very different life from the one that had first delighted John Stuart Mill so much. And he was known to be, at a dinner party, people enjoyed his company. I mean, he was just so extraordinarily smart. So you'd go. So Thou goes to see him and in a crowd and is immediately impressed by John Stuart Mill's intelligence, and then says, okay, this is the guy we have to convince if we're going to be making any progress in France. We have Mill will be the guy. So at any rate, to change this life into the one of seclusion is really incredible. I should say, though, that they're of course extraordinarily productive. And I would say the two of them together, but John Stuart, having received most of the credit for much of this, and I think rightfully so. But on a lot of things they write together, and they write a lot of things together after they're looking about as John Stuart Mill looks in the T-shirt. That is once they're getting on, they're married and so on. So. In terms of the actual, writing, Hayek's writing on Mill, there are a number of themes that I want to emphasize that Hayek focuses on. First, this influence of Harriet. Just how much is the stuff on socialism due to Harriet or whatever. For almost everyone who writes on John Stuart Mill, and well, I don't know about almost everyone, but for many, that's a key issue. What was Harriet's influence? And the follow-up question is, and was it a good thing? And so, for people who like that John Stuart Mill kind of flirted with socialism, they might say, well, no, it wasn't. She didn't have any influence. And John Stuart Mill, he's the smart one, and he went towards socialism all on his own. Right? So that's Herbert Feiner, for instance. He doesn't think that he won't accept that Mill kind of moves in that direction as a result of the influence of some woman. Right? It's Mill on his own. He does that. And for Hayek, the kind of flirting with socialism, as you might imagine, is not such a great thing. And so he might tend toward then, and some other people who are fall in that sort of camp, might tend toward saying, well, Mill was a smart guy, but he got overly influenced by this woman he loved. And so that's sort of how the influence questions kind of divide out. Hayek does a pretty good job, I think, of being fair, and part of it is, by letting them speak for themselves, so that you get to see. Chapter 6 is particularly interesting because it talks about, or it takes us through the revisions of political economy. So you can see Mill writing to Harriet, I'm losing this thing, writing to Harriet to say, well, you want me to say population here, and I'm going to say happiness instead, or something like that. So at any rate, Hayek attributes much of Mill's interest in marriage and divorce to Harriet. I shouldn't say quite to Harriet, Harriet does write on that, but to their situation. to their very difficult situation, trying to carve out a sort of space for their relationship in the 19th century. As I say, he lets Mill speak for himself in this regard. Mill himself writes an essay which Hayek publishes in its entirety as chapter 3 of the Friendship, where he basically, she says, I want you to lay out your views on women, divorce, whatever, the women question. And so he writes this essay for her. Then Mill says, I actually think the reason she liked me or loved me, was that she was attracted to my views on women. And so he sort of flips around the way people have kind of read Mill Taylor. People have said, well, Mill got drawn into it by Taylor, and Mill himself says, well, in fact, Taylor got drawn to me because of my views that I had, as I say, very early on, 1830. They're not quite sure of the date of this, but 32 is roughly about when they think he wrote that essay for her. But he's clearly consistent with her, his views. However, whatever predates what, and I think Mill's words are actually, the ones we should trust most on this. So that he had these views, he expressed them to Harriet. She concurs with much of what he says, and at least on divorce and so on, the right to own property and to work in the labor market and so on. And so they have a meeting of the minds on that. So I don't think there's a lot of Mill getting pushed around by Harriet in that respect. Second, there will be some other places where we come back to Harriet. Mill and Dichtel. So the second thing that Hayek is very fascinated by, of course, and this comes to the socialism views that are sort of there around the edges of Mill's political economy, is just what was the relationship between Mill and Dichtel. And if you look at the autobiography, there's one reference to Gustav, and Hayek thinks, though, that there's a lot more to it, and there's quite a bit of correspondence between them, which he discovers. And so that starts to put the influence of or relationships between Mill and the French socialists in a better perspective. So Hayek writes this early essay, John Stuart Mill at the age of 25, where he shows that he's quite intrigued by that relationship, and then he pulls the correspondence together. So I mentioned earlier that Dichtel attends the meeting of the debating society, and Mill basically blows everyone away in the room, and Dichtel then, as I say, targets Mill as the person he needs to be writing if he wants to get people on board in terms of socialism. They write back and forth many letters, some of which are in the collection. Dichtel trying to convince Mill over and over again that Saint-Simonism is at that point Comte has left the Saint-Simonian group, but that it's a feasible sort of experiment for people to try. Mill eventually comes down against Auguste Comte, but is willing in the principles to allow for Saint-Simonian experiments to sort of flourish and take place. Okay, then rationalism, third sort of big theme I wanted to hit on. Some of you may know from Individualism, True and False, and some of the other Hayek works that you've read where he's mentioned, John Stuart Mill, that he puts Mill in a long tradition of rationalists as opposed to the British empiricists. And he has this notion that those rationalists are constructivists and he's not in favor of the sort of proposals that they think they can propose and design for society. I think Hayek is harsh, overly harsh on Mill in this respect. But even putting that aside, what's interesting in the book is that Hayek, that's where Hayek finds Harriet's influence to be the most, and he would say then the most damaging. So he thinks that Harriet pushes Mill from being in the empirical tradition, the tradition of Smith and Bacon, but say Smith, toward being a more rationalist, a more constructivist designer, planner, whatever, and that it's Harriet who does that too, which is an odd conclusion to come to. It's not. I mean, now it's been over 50 years since he came to it, but in 1951. Most people at that point would have said that Mill's autobiography, where he says Harriet taught me about poetry and to be, the softer, more humanities-oriented kind of person. That was the standing presumption up until 1951, and then we have Hayek who comes along and says, well, in fact, notwithstanding what Mill said in the autobiography, in fact, Harriet did push John Stuart Mill to be more of a, as I say, rationalist. And I think, I think he may be right in that, in the sense that Harriet was more optimistic about what could be done. How much, Jim said yesterday, well, I'm not sure what you can do except sort of propose ideas, so you put them out there and then let people, decide whether they're worth taking up or not. And I think that's a good characterization of a John Stuart Mill. So, you put Fourier out there, you put Saint-Simon out there, and so on, and you let people try these experiments. But Harriet was more convinced that she had the answers. And so and you can see her pushing John Stuart to say, well, this will work. We can change human behavior and human characters. And John Stuart Mill's, I think, a little, as I say, Hayek is a little rough on him in this respect. I think he's more cautious than she was. So rationalism and her influence. The other thing I would say, this really kind of summarizes what I've already said, except that I would just add this one aside at the bottom, which you may have guessed given what I just said about how he's rough on John Stuart Mill. There's a long debate about John Stuart Mill, whether he's a planner or not, or a rationalist or an a priorist or an empiricist, and I come down on this, I think, a little bit on a different side from Hayek on that one. But there's no doubt that she was pushing him in that direction. Okay, political economy. Fourth and biggest theme. Well, I don't know if it's the biggest, but a big theme. And as I said, a really long and great chapter of the book is the book with the chapter with the correspondence on Mill's political economy. Many of you probably know that John Stuart Mill has this famous distinction in the beginning of the chapter on property in his Principles of Political Economy, where he says laws of production are technically determined, but the laws of distribution are human institutions. And thereafter followed huge line of scholarship that Sraffa takes up in the 20th century about whether you can actually separate laws of distribution and production. And many people have argued that John Stuart Mill sees this separation, and that Mill argues that you can change distributive arrangements without any implications for production. So that there's a separation in a sort of Ricardian sense there. If you read a little farther beyond the famous distinction that he makes, you can then see that he's got some stuff about, in fact, what happens after you change the distribution rules, the norms by which things are distributed, and how they depend on laws and customs, and need to involve consent. And Hayek is very critical of John Stuart Mill for making this distinction. So this is from Fatal Conceit, which we're not quite sure if it's really Hayek, but at any rate, You know, it's probably John Stuart Mill as much as anyone who's responsible for spreading this error. He overlooks the dependence, the general equilibrium point, dependence of size on the use made of existing opportunities. So Hayek thinks that that distinction is spurious and has been bad for economics. So one question is then, you know, is that distinction and then the follow-up recommendations for socialistic arrangements and so on, is that because of Harriet's influence, or, you know, is it just John Stuart Mill kind of struggling with things? Just to make sure I made this point, Hayek's wrong in this. Yeah, I mean, he's wrong. John Stuart Mill knows that there's a consequence that follows when you change distributive arrangements, but he's very much in line with almost everyone in 1951. So this is the standard interpretation of John Stuart Mill at this, well, a major interpretation of John Stuart Mill at this time, and it's really not until you know, Sam Hollander and some other people do some work on John Stuart Mill that this gets revised later in the century. So here's one example back to the, you know, Mill-Taylor influence. So we're trying to then look at Mill answering Harriet's comments about political economy, and in particular about the chapters on property, in which the famous distinction is made. In the New Matter, one of the sentences you have canceled is a favorite of mine. It is probable that this will finally depend upon considerations not to be measured by the coarse standard, which in the present state of human improvement is the only one that can be applied to it. So part of this is, you know, is socialism, are we ready for socialism? And the question is, you know, do people need to change before we would be ready? So the coarse standard by which the present state of human improvement, you know, we've got people who are, you know, the way they are now, are we ready? What I meant was that whether individual agency or socialism would be best ultimately, both being necessarily very important now and both susceptible of immense improvement, will depend on the comparative attractions they will hold out to human beings with all their capacities, both individual and social, infinitely more developed than at present. So Mill's saying, you know, were we better, we could, you know, then would we be ready, better people, would we be ready for socialism? I do not think it is English improvement only that is too backward to enable this point to be ascertained. For if English character is also starved in its social part, I think continental is as much or even more so in its individual. And he goes on. So he's trying to answer that criticism. Human nature being what it was, he didn't think that England or France was ready for socialism on a wide scale at this point. And he goes on then in the Principles, the passage that survives, to say, you know, it'll be for experience to determine. This is why I say, you know, I think he's pretty cautious, and that Hayek thinks he's perhaps, you know, Hayek is perhaps overly harsh on him. The alteration he does make for Taylor, the alteration I've made in the sentence of PE was, instead of placard their intemperance, to say placard their enormous families. So it's actually changed the sentence pretty significantly, and I guess it pleased her enough that, you know, that's what they went with in the publication. A couple of conclusions, and I'll be happy to hear your comments on this. And the point I wanted to make by way of conclusion is not so much, you know, well, Hayek was right here or right there. I think, you know, I've made those points and so on. But I did want to say there's one debate that's in the 19th century that just isn't in the 20th century. But I think I actually got ahead of myself. So let me just first say, you know, going back to socialism, Mill, and so on. I think Mill's position on socialism finally comes down to sort of adoption by experimental example and adoption by success. So competition, let people see what works, and then go ahead and do what seems to work. So then the question is, you know, is he a rationalist as Hayek would suggest he is? It doesn't seem to me that he is. It does seem to me that he's more cautious than Hayek allows, in the sense that he's not trying to construct some sort of order or to impose it, or he has no policy recommendations. Not that he says, you know, this is what the policy recommendation should be for socialism or competitive experiments. And in no case does he say, at least that I know of in the principles, you know, that he or anyone else, Harriet notwithstanding, has the ability to foresee how institutional change is going to evolve. So he's laying the alternatives out there, and this is what makes Mill so frustrating sometimes, because they're all out there. But it's not that he's going to say that this is a particular experiment that we should use as a policy recommendation. The point I wanted to just finish with is about a debate that's not there in the 20th century. So in the 19th century, I mentioned very early on, there's lots of talk of slavery and lots of talk, and this is what Vanity is about, of hierarchy. And someone, I forget who it was yesterday, who said, you know, mentioned, you know, Peart Levy on hierarchy. Well, by hierarchy, what David and I would mean is, you know, different types, different people, some of whom are make better choices on balance than other people. And the big debate in the 19th century is, you know, so are those choices institutionally determined or natural? Is it the case that Irish people, for instance, are just naturally inferior, going to have, and the chapters on property are largely about, you know, what's going on in Ireland, what's going on in among the poor in England and so on, but especially in Ireland. Will they always have families that are too large and so on? And Mill says, you know, it's not, they're not going to, it's not a matter of nature, it's that the institutions in Ireland are totally messed up. And he spent a lot of what he writes is on Ireland and Irish institutions. So the political economists are on the side of institutions in this big debate. And then in the story we tell in Vanity, they lose the debate. The sociologists, the biologists, especially biologists, the anthropologists, all push the nature explanation for differences in economic choices and political choices too, and say that it's some people are not naturally incapable of self-governance. So that wins out, but then in the 20th century, that after World War II largely, that viewpoint gets attacked yet again and revised. And by the time we get to Hayek, World War II, and 1951 when he's writing this, there's no hint of the argument that the poor are inferior. When he's talking about socialism, that argument just isn't part of the debate anymore, though it's very much central to the 19th century debate. In the 20th century, there's no hint of race, there's no hint of, you know, natural differences, there's no hint of inferiority, and so on, as people are trying to look at the socialist calculation debate, for instance. It's really about, you know, whether you can plan and get things right and so on. So it's quite, though it's a parallel debate, not parallel, but it's a debate that is very similar to what happened in the 19th century. It has one key difference, which is that all of that stuff about inferiority, though it's very present early in the 20th century with eugenics and so on, by 1951 it's absent, and it's simply not part of what Hayek is reading into Mill or seeing in Mill. So it's very interesting, I think, sort of resolution, I don't know if it's a resolution, but, you know, difference to these kind of similar sets of debates. So that's the Mill-Taylor collection in a nutshell, and I'm happy to take questions or comments or whatever. Thanks.
As the American salesman pushing by, don't forget to read her presidential address where she goes through the von Mises response to Mill. And it's the most remarkable debate with a dead person in the history of the world, because Mises lets Mill's friends have the last word, and they might win. But she talks about this in her We're All Persons Now. Okay, who was it? Okay. Say your name for the, I don't know, say your name for the camera. Because
Stefan Kolev. Thank you, Sandra. It was wonderful. I learned a lot about Mill, but I have two questions on Hayek.
Okay.
The first question is, as far as I read, this involvement into the Mill-Taylor project was also related to his own divorce problems, which was basically in the late 40s. Right?
Yes, so you know, just as I was finishing, I was thinking, so there are lots of parallels. One of them is 19th century, there's a big debate about socialism. 20th century, big debate about socialism. Another parallel is, you know, John Stuart Mill and Harriet Taylor have this very difficult relationship and situation, and then so does Hayek in the 20th century. So there is a little bit in the introduction about the personal parallelism. You know, I don't want to say that that's the source of all of Hayek's interest in this, but I think it's clearly, you know, there's clearly something there, and recognizing the enormity of the cost and just the sadness of the situation, I think, you know, may have been he may have been better able to recognize that because of his own situation. I don't know, but you know, that's a speculation.
Do you know where he started his project? Just for biographical reasons, was it in the late 40s or mid 40s?
It was in the 40s. Yeah.
And I have a second question. Is there some systematic exposition on Hayek as a historian of thought?
Yeah, good question. Not that I know of. Trying to think of whether Bruce has done anything like that, but I don't think so. No. Yeah, you know, and the point I make about, you know, letting people talk in their own words and so on, and that, you know, today that's, you know, we're all about manuscript collection and, you know, getting things that haven't been published and this and that. But in 1951, it was, you know, it was not something that someone would think would be good historiographical practice. I mean, it wasn't like, you know, let's push everyone to do stuff like that. Instead, it was, you know, let's collect some things and write about them. So I think it was very unusual for him to take that tactic.
Thank you.
Well, maybe I can answer a couple things. One is, what I know on Hayek as a historian of economics is his Scottish Enlightenment stuff.
Yeah, which is quite good.
Which is quite different. And that one of the things her book documents is Hayek changed the received edition of Mill's autobiography. That the Mill's autobiography that we have now in the Toronto edition, it exists because of Hayek's work. Hayek realized that the version that came from Mill's stepdaughter is totally unreliable on some issues, and so you've got to expand the manuscript. One of the things that's most remarkable, she has some documentation, Hayek is working from notes of a manuscript of Mill's autobiography, which is locked up in a Baltimore warehouse. He can't see it, but this is who Levy is. They had notes on one of the drafts of Mill's autobiographies, and so this is, you know, that's what the making of the Toronto autobiography. It doesn't look anything like what was in the World Classics, which is one of the main texts. Which, you know, so this just, I mean, he changed Mill's autobiography. He's changed the received text. And you say,
but there's not been a study of him as a historian.
No, I don't think anybody's good enough.
It's not.
Next.
Andres Oranchi, University of Utrecht. Thank you very much, Sandra, for this fascinating talk. I was very much enthralled. Could you perhaps describe in more detail how Hayek went about collecting the dispersed letters of Mill?
Yeah, good question. So, and there are a couple of examples in the book. One of the things he did, well, of course, he knew everyone, right? So he wrote all the people, and as David said, these are all collectors. So some people he knew had letters. So that's one thing he did. But to be more systematical about it, he put ads in the Times, and so he'd say, you know, looking for letters of John Stuart Mill, and you know, please contact so-and-so. And so he placed a lot of advertisements in a lot of places. And then as he did that, then someone would say, well, in my attic, there's this box of letters, and I know so-and-so has some more letters. And, so it was just that rudimentary. It's amazing though it worked.
P.W. Jones of University of Amsterdam. I recollect, it's just a little anecdote I want to share with you. I recollect reading the diary of Oscar Morgenstern, and one of the interesting things, and he's describing his also moving to the US, and one of the interesting things that struck me, this is 17 years ago, I couldn't place it at that time, but he said, yeah, I met with Hayek again, and I met with Hayek, and Hayek keeps on going on this Harriet Taylor story. What's so interesting about that? Why is he doing that? He just kept on bumping into Hayek, and he kept on, so the hunt is obviously on. He's just annoying everybody. Not only sweet letters to Keynes, but annoying everybody. So,
that's funny.
And so, and Morgenstern agreed. Why is he interested in it? So, why is he interested in it?
Well, I think he's interested because of the work on the chapters on property in the Principles of Political Economy. I mean, if you had to narrow it down to one thing, that's where Mill says laws of distribution are separate from the laws of production. Hayek thinks that sets economics onto the wrong track. And, actually, who is it who says? Jepson actually says, that Ricardo shunted the car of economics onto the wrong track. And if Mill makes that distinction, then Mill and Ricardo are in the same line, and they lead right up through Sraffa and Maurice Daub and so on. And if that's what Mill is, then Hayek, who on many counts thinks Mill is a really interesting person and economist, is then going to be very conflicted. So wants to be able to say that, well, if that's where Mill is, it's Harriet's influence. I'm probably not being fair to Hayek, so I'm putting it more dramatically than it is. I think he is fair to Mill, but was it Harriet's influence that caused Mill to make that distinction, and then to write the further passages and the revisions in 51 and 54 and so on, which say, yes, some of these some of these Saint-Simonian experiments seem to be working, and so on. So that's where the fascination, I think, originates.
My name is Ali Khan from Johns Hopkins. I have two. Thank you for this. This is fascinating. And I think that my first question will relate to what was asked here, and it's this business about just looking at it in the register of welfare economics. And so you have this distinction between efficiency and distribution.
Yeah.
And the fact that it goes back to Mill, I knew. What I did not know, and which I find this slide fascinating, is Hayek's connection, because fatal conceit is just looked down upon.
Right, yeah.
But his connection with size. So the thing about size is that it leads directly into non-convexities. So you have this whole, when there are increasing returns to scale, that's where this distinction falls flat. And in a certain sense, 51 modern welfare economics is really an eclipse of non-convexities. So you have this plaintive prefatory note by John Hicks of a reprinting of his 1939 paper in 1984, saying that these guys are attacking us for not really getting into the essentials of welfare economics, but we did non-convexities, and these guys have taken non-convexities away. So I find that very perceptive. And then what I find even more fascinating is your statement that he was clearly wrong. Hayek was clearly wrong. And so I don't know what you mean. So that's my one question.
Okay.
And my second question is, we are already now sensitized to we saw this yesterday, mercantilism being a contested word. And so along that direction, the rationalist is a very difficult word.
Yeah.
And for Hayek, it has a particular resonance because there is Mr. Oakeshott down in the corridor. And Oakeshott has a very rich meaning of what he means by rationalist. And a lot of this, some of the phraseology that you used made me hear you talk in Oakeshottian accents. And so is that what rationalist was? Is that what he understood? Did Mill and Harriet Taylor know this word? Did they have a conception of what it meant? So in some sense, are we again using this big business of anachronism? So these are my two questions.
Those are both really good comments. So in terms of, was he right or was he wrong? My point was the Hollander point, that going back through David Ricardo and John Stuart Mill, that the pattern of final demands will actually, if they were to change, will have an effect on productive outputs. So that you can't have a separation of distribution and production. You can't. I mean, they don't have, let me put it that way, a separation of production and distribution. So I wasn't referring to returns to scale at all. That argument wasn't cast in terms of returns to scale. It's an interesting point. The fact that he says size, yeah.
He says size.
Yeah.
Now this response shows me there may be a macro micro undercurrent.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. Rationalism. I wasn't very precise, so let me just say that. The way I was trying to use the word was to make a point about the methodology, and so when Mill is called the saint of rationalism, that is a reflection, at least in my mind, of Mill being someone who's not in the empiricist tradition. So I'm using it in Hayek, in individualism, true and false. May not be it's not the only way to use the term, of course.
On the size issue, remember, Mill is defending a socialism which gets rid of material incentives and moves it to approbation. So the incentive mechanism is public opinion. And so you've got very different properties for dealing with it.
It clearly shows these are worth exploring in more detail.
Absolutely. Absolutely. This is the place to start.
Thank you. And I have a few questions about facts and the archives, informational questions. In 1943-5, I don't remember, the Finlay lecture, I mean, the thing that gives individualism true or false, Hayek goes to Dublin, and there, O'Brien or something like that, if I'm... Yeah, and he says, well, we have those letters, etc. And he finds that, what is the significance in terms of quantity and in terms of quality of what he found there in Dublin? I mean, what's the percentage of the whole, is that a big part of the whole thing? And is that the most important that Straffa was talking about? Or that's the first question. The second question is about, because I knew that, of course, Hayek was searching for Mill's papers, but I didn't know that it was with such urge and important to him. And I'm struck, I'm surprised, because if I compare that to what he did for Menger, I mean, after all, if Hayek is something, he's the representative of Austrian school in the 20th century. That's a minimal definition in the dictionary. And in 1934 or 36, he reprints, okay, puts an introduction, right? But it's just a reprint of Menger's papers, right? The two books, a few papers, doesn't even care to take the French text, the only text in French by Menger, doesn't even care to look for other stuff. He puts a whole list of publications on the end, and that's it. Well, writes another introduction at some point for, I mean, and at the same time, he claims intellectual inheritance. I'm the guy who puts Menger available to everybody again, and I'm the heir. So, I am, how would you explain that difference of treatment? He's the heir, but what he does after all is a reprint, right? And on the other side, he spends years and trips and I don't know what, to find the story with the woman of John Stuart Mill. So here, I would like to know why there's difference of treatment. One, maybe besides the laugh about it, there might be something more in that. I mean, after all, self-claimed heir, yeah, well, you know, something could be done out of it in some way.
Yeah.
And the third point would be about this literary criticism that you said at one point. And I think this is very important nowadays because there are many, not as despite McCloskey's Rhetorics of Economics, etc. In economics, not that much, but among historians, there is really, at least in continental, I don't know in the States and in the UK, but at least on the continent, there is a lot of interest now raising on that literary aspect, and in many colloquiums held by historians, pure historians of historical things, it is important the way that literary is included in how there is kind of a rediscovery of the art of writing history among historians. So those are the 3 points.
That's a very good point. And so, you know, today what he did seems much more in line with what many people are arguing should be done and so on. My point is just that 60 years ago, it's not, it would have been very unusual for someone to say, I'm going to pull together a bunch of letters, I'm going to get both sides of the correspondence, then I'm going to explain some of the things about the correspondence, and I'm going to call that a book. So I found it really impressive that was the approach that he took, especially because he clearly is interested in influence, and so it would have, and he has a case that he's trying to make, although he's trying also to be fair. So it's one way of constraining himself, right? So he can't make a case that, well, it's all Harriet, if in fact he's publishing the letters, both sides of the correspondence. And so I think it's a way of inducing himself to be as fair as he can and let the letters sort of, something emerge out of the letters. On the Menger point, it's a very good point, and I would also mention Jepson, who's the guy I've worked on more than anyone, and his letters don't get pulled together until Calls and Black takes that project up much later. So maybe it's partly just, it was Mill's turn. I mean, and Hayek makes the point that, 100 years after this enormously important person died, there is no collection and not a good sense except the autobiography, which, as he says, is singularly unhelpful in terms of telling us some of the key points about, where he got his intellectual, what the intellectual influences were on his thought. And so he may have just thought, well, I think there's a particular interest in Mill, partly Harriet, partly Deichtel, partly the socialism, partly the production distribution, but also, just this enormously important liberal of the 19th century who hadn't been honored with the collection of his work. And Hayek clearly sees this as a problem. Mid 20th century, this person has been dead for a very long time. He was, the most important economist of the 19th century, at least a certain portion of the 19th century, and yet nothing had been done to systematically pull together what he wrote. So I think if you just kind of think, okay, Menger, Mill, let's do Mill first. So it might have been something like that. But then there's this special, things that draw him into the Mill. And it was later that Menger and Jevons then get looked at in morality for that matter.
What about the percentage of the
percentage? Yeah, I'm sorry, I don't know. I have a sense that it was, a large number. So, not just 3 or 4 letters, but boxes. But as a proportion of the total, I'm just not sure because, I know there were many boxes and I just don't know.
So not that important. Important, but like many other things.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. The essay was important, the Ricardo essay.
Olivier Paganelli, you mentioned the interest in the influence of Taylor on Mill.
Yeah.
Is there any interest in the influence on Mill on Taylor?
Yeah.
And if there is, can you explain a little bit more what that was?
Yeah. That's a really, really good question, and I can't say there's much that I'm aware of in terms of reading Hayek. So it's not like he says, well, this is one area where she tempered what she thought because of what John Stuart Mill. It pretty much seems to go the other way. And most of the scholars I know, so all the articles that have been written, many articles have been written, you know, was it a partnership? Wasn't it a partnership? Did she write this? Didn't she write this? You know, and so on. And I think that's largely just that, you know, people have been more interested in Mill than in her. There is, of course, her collected works. It's called her collected works. It's not everything that she wrote, but that's been pulled together. And I've read the introduction to that, and there's not, I wouldn't say there's a great deal of speculation about whether Mill influenced her. It's much more sort of the circumstances of her life, that kind of thing, which, you know, may be a problem with the introduction.
Anna Maria Conley. I'm interested in just how much influence Harriet Taylor had on J.S. Mill. And it's not clear to me. I mean, obviously Hayek thought the influence was great enough that he did this friendship book. But on the other hand, what I hear going on here is some tittering about this woman influencing this man. I mean, was she really like a collaborator, or was she just? And if so, why didn't her name appear, like Rose and Milton Friedman, like Marx and Engels? Was it the time that women's names just didn't appear on scholarly work? Is that what happened?
Well, so Mill does give her credit. He doesn't. They aren't co-authored works as they've been published, but he does on a number of occasions say, you know, well, this is really largely due to her. Subjection of women, for one, is one thing, of course, but there's some other. Well, the principles of political economy as well. He gives her a great deal of credit for that, and he did put a dedication to her at the front of a small run of political economy that was published. And there's some correspondence between her and Mill, and then also John Taylor, about that dedication. She writes John Taylor and says, John Mill wants to put a dedication in political economy to me. You know, what do you think? John Taylor says, what are you thinking? But they do go ahead and they publish, as I say, a small run with the dedication in it, and then the full run of the book is published, or the book is then also published without that dedication in it, and most of what you see, you know, would not have that. Now, that's not to say that it's a co-authorship. It's not, doesn't say she's a co-author, but it does give her credit for many of the ideas in the book. She was an important thinker, so I think she was original. She wasn't as broad as John Stuart Mill. There were some things that interested her and that she was very determined she wanted to write about, and would come back to those points over and over again. But she couldn't have written a book on logic. She couldn't have written about Ireland. She couldn't have written, you know, many of the things that John Stuart Mill was able to write. So, you know, in terms of her reputation relative to his, I think it's deservedly not as elevated in stature as his. But that's not to say that she didn't have important and original things to say.
Now on those works, like on the subjection of women, in which he does reference her influence, is there a difference in his style or his thinking or his emphasis that would give us a clue that she really had, you know, a significant influence on what he wrote?
Yeah. His style is very distinctive, and most of what I've read that has his name on it reads as though it's his. So though she may have influenced some of the content or the ideas, I think he writes.
So we can't say this was John S., this was J.S. Mill, not Harriet Taylor writing.
That's my sense
his
of it.
ideas.
Yeah, I don't claim to have all the answers, but that's my sense of it. If you read her letters, they read much differently from his, and her style is one in which there are lots of interjections and exclamation marks and underlines and circles and things written sideways, and just very, whereas his prose, he writes a sentence that is a paragraph long, and no word is out of place. And that's just how his mind worked and how he was able to write. And then when you read the Principles of Political Economy, that's how it reads, as opposed to her much more choppy writing. And then there's this, and but don't forget this, and that sort of writing. So I don't mean that as a trying to belittle her, but there is a very different stylistic element.
Didn't he give her credit for the production distribution separation?
I don't know.
I think I remember. Well,
John, did you have a quick thing?
I just a follow-up. If you don't mind, I just have a follow-up on. You see, but influence. I mean, since you brought in literary criticism yesterday, influence can be multifaceted.
Yeah.
And Sandy organized a wonderful conference about 4 years ago, colloquium on these letters at the Liberty Fund.
Yeah.
And one of the things we read then was these essays on liberty, this famous essay. And one of the sections, at that time, I thought, this is just a love letter to Harriet Taylor. So it's this question of, even though you may not be influenced by someone's writing, by writing to that person is exercising a very strong influence.
Yeah.
And so you may be a co-author just by the fact that you listen to what I write to you. And I am keeping in mind that you are going to listen to what I write to you. And that shows up in the text. And it would be wonderful now that these things are on the table to go back to that particular section which I thought in that essays on liberty, and to see it through this correspondence. So it's of great substantive content.
And I'll add one other thing. David mentioned approbation. These are people who, even when they withdraw from their very public life, know that they have a very public life. And so they know that they will be read, and every word that they write will be read. One of the reasons the story is so sad, I think, is that they want to act in a way that will be worthy of praise, to use a Smithian sort of turn of phrase, praiseworthy. And so, so one of the questions is always, that is raised about them is, was their relationship before they were married sexual or not? And people have come down on different sides of the question. There's no evidence, there's no textual evidence that it was or that it was. There is textual evidence, or there is a claim in the text that it was not. And some people read that claim and they say, well, of course they would write that because they know people were going to read that later. My sense, having thought about it and kind of read a lot about them, or by them, is actually that they did not have a sexual relationship before they were married. And the reason they didn't is they wanted to act in this way that they thought they couldn't be blamed. They knew they were in love with each other, and they knew that Harriet was not going to live with John after a certain period of time, but they were not going to do anything that would, down the road, other generations later, be blameworthy. And I don't know if that's right or not. It's a reading of what they both wrote and how they acted, and it makes some sense to me, at least, because they are very. They talk about, though they give up these friendships, though people have have turned their backs on them. Though they've lost, John Stuart Mill has lost his family, he's not done something to deserve the kind of treatment that he received. I think that makes it that much sadder too. So maybe it's just like a good tragedy.
Okay, so I want to go back to my question about the World Economic Society in a way, but the sort of larger questions, what this project presents both about Hayek's understanding of himself and also his perception in the economics profession, because doing this amount of work, as people know, it's got an opportunity cost. There's amount of work in all this, and one issue that I think arises, and it's partly sort of some of the issues I'm raising in my paper, is to what extent by this time in the mid-40s had Hayek already seen himself as being primarily a social philosopher, kind of having left economics. Now there is the issue that we have these economists of great standing doing these kinds of things. So you can say, well, this is what people, economists were more erudite back then and doing this kind of thing, but it's still the case that it did have an opportunity cost, and there are going to be not so erudite economists, including maybe some in Chicago, that would see all this sort of differently. One person I'm wondering about who reacted, and I still have a very good sense of his take on Hayek, is Frank Knight. And how did Frank Knight react to the overall Mill project and these letters and so on? And because in one sense, one of the issues going on at this time is Chicago moving away from Knight and social philosophy, or wanting to do this in the late 1940s. But I'm wondering, so there's the broader question of does the fact that Hayek put this much effort in this kind of project really reflect that he pretty much really already left economics as such and was moving and really become a social philosopher? But also this issue of the fact that he would put this much effort, does this in some way diminish his standing in the economics profession? But in particular, what we know about Knight's take on the project?
One thing I would mention is a lot of this happens during the war, and many economists in Britain are part of the war effort, and Hayek can't be, because he's not British. So in terms of what else could he be doing? It's not like he can be down at 10 Downing Street or whatever. So that's one thing to keep in mind. The second point I would make is the fact that he doesn't do the full earlier and later letters. He collects a bunch of them, puts them in boxes, and gives them to Francis Minica. He wasn't willing to do it forever. So I think he had this special interest in kind of some intellectual interests in the socialism stuff and so on, and Untitled, and then Harriet's influence. But once he got finished with that particular project, he was ready to pass it on, and really only willing to write the introduction. But I think it's a good point that he may have, at this point, already been seeing himself as doing something a little different from the mainstream. Frank Knight, Knight clearly has an interest in Mill, so there's that to keep in mind.
Did Knight see Mill differently than Hayek?
Yeah, I would think so. Yeah, definitely.
When she began the project, I remember Bruce sent a copy of a letter from Samuelson when it had just been finished, and Samuelson said, "My God, this is just wonderful. Now you have to write the life of Mill." So.
And there's a lot of correspondence between Pat and Hayek, and Hayek clearly did not want to write the biography. He was willing to read it and commented on it and so on, but he at that point he wasn't really. But Pat is very grateful for all of the comments that he can get, and for the fact that the letters are available for him to write. And then there's Robbins. Is it Robbins? Yeah, Robbins says, well, it's really too bad that Hayek didn't write this, because Pat's biography is not the best that could have been written.
I think what Mitch is looking for is when he applies to Chicago, Knight saying we will not hire him in the department
because he wrote it, did this book.
That's okay.
I don't have a good sense of Knight's take on Hayek. I really don't. That's probably right.
Well, remember, Keynes is the last published work was on Newton and alchemy, which is where the Newton literature changed. So these people worked in dimensions that we can't even imagine.
Michael?
One at a time.
So my interest, Michael Thomas, Utah State University. My major interest would be, just to throw something out there and see what your reaction is. So, knowing Hayek's sort of contemporary debate over socialism, he must have been quite frustrated with what seemed to have a very simple argument about calculation and sort of an extended order and all this kind of stuff. But something that David's pointed out to me is in Socialism, von Mises' book, he mentions Mill specifically saying he's got a version of socialism that works. He's the best defender of socialism, and that's the family, right? The very small order socialism.
Yeah.
So I wonder if you could speak to the idea that Hayek finds a fascination in Mill because he's the only serious challenge to sort of this strong critique of the project that Mises and Hayek are working on.
So Mill's position is that socialism might work if we were better people, right? So if we changed to become people who would restrict our family size, even though the incentives to restrict family size for the 19th century population was really the issue, even though the incentives on family formation would be severely different or radically different under socialism. So you could have as many children as you want, and the state would look after them. And so, in order not to have as many children as you could, then you would need to be a better person, given the institutional arrangements under socialism. And Mill says, well, maybe it's possible that public opinion could matter enough to people that they would voluntarily limit the size of their family and not be a burden on the state. But they'd have to be better people, right? Or public opinion would need to be so oppressive, right, that it made people, it acted as an incentive the way private property does under capitalistic arrangements. And he's not terribly enamored with the idea of public opinion being that horribly restrictive. So instead, it's got to be that we're better. But he recognizes that perhaps we could be better, right? We could just respond differently to, and take into account that we should behave in a praiseworthy manner, whatever. Mises recognizes that argument in John Stuart Mill and says that Mill's got the best defense of socialism, but it's one which involves us being different people than we are today. And Hayek doesn't account for affirmation the way that John Stuart Mill does. And so I don't think he really recognizes that possibility to the extent that, I don't think he sees that as having much force. And so it's just not a very credible possibility.